It was Halloween night when I decided to sit down and tell these 3 stories, because cold nights and lingering darkness make everything feel closer, like the world is holding its breath. They're all true. I either lived them or I watched them unfold close enough that the details won't leave me. If you like to stay up all night with the lights low and the heater humming, listen up. These are 3 scary, true winter horror stories. Story 1. The Cabin That Wasn't Empty. I thought I'd scored the deal of a lifetime. My friend and I were broke college kids with 2 weeks of no classes and a desperate need to get as far away from our phones and responsibilities as possible. There was a cabin listing online: deep Vermont woods, private road, cozy winter retreat, and a price that made both of us suspicious in the best way. The owner assured us the place was empty between bookings. He said someone had just left. We packed sweaters, a thermos full of bad instant coffee, and enough snacks to avoid cooking for a week. Driving up the last stretch, the world shrank to white and gray. Snow pressed down on the pine branches until they drooped like tired people. The road to the cabin was the kind of private lane that disappears if you blink, a single set of tire tracks leading to a dark rectangle of trees. When we pulled up, the first weird thing hit us before we stepped out of the car. There was smoke in the chimney. The owner had said the place was empty. Smoke meant someone had been using the stove. It should have been an obvious explanation. Maybe the previous guests had left a lamp burning. But the closer we got, the more small, wrong things piled up. The porch light was on, which the owner said would be off. A pair of boots sat by the back door, wet snow dripping off the soles. Inside, the air felt lived in. Someone's powdered perfume still clung to the curtains. A mug on the counter still held the ghost of hot chocolate, and a fleece blanket was half spread over the couch, like someone had been sitting there, watching the same silence we were stepping into. We laughed it off. We told ourselves we'd lucked out and found a place in usable condition. I noticed a corkboard by the hallway where guests had pinned Polaroids and notes. One of the photos was the kind of thing you only take after a sleep-deprived night of stories: a blurry smile, the caption, "Spring Trip 18, a date half rubbed away." Tucked under a stack of mail on the table, I found a small, soft-covered journal. The handwriting was tight and hurried. The first pages were mundane: grocery lists, the kind of mindless things people scribble when making coffee. Then the entries shifted. The journal belonged to someone who said they were being watched. The author wrote about footsteps in the snow that didn't belong to the driveway, about the taste of copper in their mouth at night, about small, precise scratches left on the underside of the porch roof.
"They come at night," one entry said. 3 knocks, always 3 knocks, like a slow count. The handwriting grew sloppier on later pages. The author mentioned hearing a sleeping bag moved beneath the crawl space, finding a patch of disturbed snow that circled the house like someone had been walking loops. There was a line that stopped me cold. "If I go missing, check the crawl space under the east porch." We tried to be brave. We told each other there's a reasonable explanation for everything. Then the storm started. This isn't the cinematic, romantic storm. It was the kind of winter weather that removed later options. Heavy, steady snow that took away cell service, filled tire ruts in minutes, and turned the road into a gray smear. The lights flickered. We tightened the deadbolt and pulled the curtains closed like kids hiding under sheets. Night stretched out and thickened until it felt like a wet blanket draped over the property. Every small sound magnified, the heater's short clank when it cycled, the house settling, our own breath. Then a sound that didn't belong to any machine. 3 knocks, slow, ordered, patient. At first we thought it was the wind. Then it came again. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The pattern was deliberate enough that laughter died in the room. We called the owner, but there was only static. Reception had been cut off with the first flurries. We called each other stupid names and tried to read, to keep busy, to pretend the journal was fiction. Every few minutes the knocks traced the windows at different heights, as if the person walking outside was the exact height of the windowsill, then the porch, then neither. The house felt smaller. The temperature seemed to drop with each sequence of knocks. At some point I remembered the journal's warning: crawl space. In the half-light, we went downstairs to the small basement and checked the area around the foundation. The crawl space was old and sagging, the kind that had to be opened with a shovel and some coaxing. Snow had piled high against the porch. I pushed aside the boards and found a gap, and when I peered in, my breath came back as fog. Under the porch, someone had cleared a little area, smoothed it, and left a sleeping bag, a flashlight with a good set of batteries, a thermos still warm to the touch, and chillingly, Polaroids, the same kind people pin on a corkboard, pictures of previous guests taken through the window at night, faces half asleep, mugs in hand, unaware. The photos were old and new, yellowed and fresh. There were names scribbled on the back of some and dates. In one, a grad student I'd read about in a campus bulletin was alone, looking toward the window with a smile that wasn't quite comfortable. We called the police as soon as the reception came back for a moment. They told us to sit tight, keep the front door locked, and their officers were on the way.
We sat with knives and flashlights and the simplest kind of fear. We were not safe in a place with other people's things inside. We could hear footsteps circling the cabin all night. Not runs or frantic scraping, loops. It was methodical. Sometimes the knocks were 3. Sometimes there was a scrape, like boots shifting in the snow. When morning finally dragged itself over the horizon, the snow had recorded everything. Footprints encircled the cabin in a precise loop. They began and ended at the same place, a modified opening one could reach from the crawl space, worn down and hidden. Officers found that opening and, according to the police report, discovered bedding, extra clothing, packages of food, and more Polaroids. The crawl space was not improvised. It had been modified and stocked, an entire sleepers camp under the house. They found more evidence in other cabins on that road. One car belonged to a missing graduate student. Her car had been found abandoned near the trailhead weeks earlier. The owner of the cabins was taken in for questioning. Neighbors said he'd been renting the place long after he should have known better, that he'd told guests the property was private and empty when it wasn't. He was reportedly facing charges for unlawful rental practices and for failing to disclose known dangers. The missing student remained missing. We left at first light with as much of our dignity and our possessions as we could gather. My friend drove like someone trying to erase the lane behind us. The journal came with me. I still have it sometimes when the wind gets loud in my apartment. I turn to the pages and read about 3 knocks and about the dread of knowing someone slept under your porch, watching whatever little domestic theater of life unfolded inside. The worst part wasn't what could have happened to us in that moment. It was the realization that someone else had already been hurt, and the pattern was old enough to have been systematic. We were lucky in the bluntest sense. We left. If you're into long, true horror tales like this, hit like and subscribe. I've got 2 more. I thought that was the worst night I'd ever have. I thought the idea of being watched from the dark would haunt me and be the one image I could never scrub clean. I was wrong. The next one sits on a lake and sounds like a person calling from underneath ice. Story 2, the shanty that appeared. My dad used to talk about ice fishing like it was another language, full of small rituals and an old private friendship with cold water. He'd been doing it for decades, and he had his spots. When he suggested Lake Superior one winter when I was 19, I thought it would be work, a man with a beard hammering holes in ice while I stared at the same pixel of frozen white for hours. My reluctance melted somewhere between the idea of hot coffee and the chance to be alone with my dad. We drove up to the lake in early February. The sky was a hard, washed steel. The wind off Superior has a way of making every sound small and sharp, like someone behind a closed door is snapping paper. We unloaded the truck and walked out onto the ice, boots scuffing, breath fogging. The lake was so big it felt like you could throw a stone and never hit the other shore. Ice shanties dotted the surface like small houses on stilts, boxes of warmth and light. We set up near a line of them, drilled holes, set lines, and spoke in the quiet way of people who have known each other for a long time. At dusk, we saw it from a few cabins down. A shanty had appeared where none had been when we left. It was simple: wooden walls, a small window with condensation, a lantern dim behind frosted glass. The immediate explanation was that another group had come late and built one, but the way it sat isolated, like a thing that had settled into place rather than been stepped into existence, made the hair on the back of my neck lift. There was smoke curling from its little stovepipe, and footprints meeting toward it that vanished at the edge of the shanty like someone had stepped inside and been swallowed. When we crossed the ice to check, the door was open a crack. Inside, it smelled like oil and the faint sweetness of someone's cologne. A thermos sat on a small table, still warm. There were 2 chairs, a cot with a blanket neatly folded, a small box and matches, and a wooden stool knocked over, as if someone had stood in a hurry.
The thing that lodged in my throat was a pair of boots that were almost new and a notebook lying open on the cot. The pages were blank except for one line scrawled in the corner. "He's under." We sat for an hour and nothing happened. Then, without any of the lead-up you'd expect in a movie, a scream came from somewhere under the ice. It was long and human and small, like someone had been caught and was being dragged through thick fabric. It rose up as if the lake itself had a throat, and it was a woman's voice. The sound came from all around, through the ice and into the hollow where our stomachs lived. It wasn't the cracking of ice. It wasn't the wind. The noise had pitch and panic and directionality. We called 911. They dispatched rescue crews, snowmobiles, and divers. If the call they received was like ours, it came frantic and thin with fear. They told us to mark the spot and stay back. The rescue teams arrived hours later, lanterns swinging and boots sinking. They cut through the ice in neat circles and lowered rigs to probe the water. They had sonar. They had divers who are used to cold that eats your breath. According to the official readout the rescuers gave, they found nothing. No body, no scrape marks, no sign that anyone had been under the ice. The hole in the lake was clean. The shanty had been moved or was gone entirely. Everything they recorded looked like it had been left in a hurry, but without the one crucial evidence a call like ours demanded.
For weeks after, people reported hearing a scream from that part of the lake. Locals talked about an old shanty that appears and disappears. An old man on the bar by the marina swore his wife had seen a light there one night and that a figure had walked off the ice as if being pulled. Some people offered more practical theories: echoes, pranksters, someone trying to stage a rescue for attention. Others said there had been drownings in that cove years ago and that underlake currents sometimes bring debris up like a throat returning names it swallowed long ago. No conclusive answer ever came. My dad sold his gear the next spring. He didn't explain it in any neat way. He just stopped going. He said he didn't like the voice that sometimes sounded like someone calling from under the lake, and he didn't want to be within earshot when a human call turned into the wind. The local police closed their file after repeated searches turned up no bodies and offered a sober, unhelpful line about insufficient evidence. Divers said they felt a coldness under the ice that their instruments couldn't measure. One of them told me later that sometimes the lake keeps its own secrets and gives them back when it decides. I still think about that scream when nights are quiet. There are two images that stick with me: the warm thermos left on a table inside a shanty that had been used recently, and the way the sound came from a direction that didn't fit any map. The part that lingers is the not knowing, whether someone was trapped and hauled away by broken ice, whether people are capable of setting up a scene for reasons we can't fathom, or whether the lake simply holds voices, like shells hold sound. You believe what you want. I keep thinking up a little notebook with "He's Under" written on the corner, and the way my dad's hands trembled when he sold the auger. He still calls sometimes, just to hear me breathe the city through the phone, and not the kind of cold that makes everything sound like a clock. You don't realize how small you are until winter swallows the light. I thought 2 was more than enough. Then I met the lodge. Story 3. The lodge with the basement. We were trying to be clever again. This was spring break, and cheap lodging was the only thing we could agree on that didn't involve my broke bank account and my roommate's grand ideas of a road trip. A lodge in Colorado came up on a message board: cheap, close to the slopes, and with an owner who answered quickly and smiled in the texts. We were late, lugging duffel bags and exhausted from a long drive. The lodge sat like a weathered postcard at the end of a pine-studded lane, a rectangle of warm light in a dark. The owner greeted us with a grin that was too wide for his face and a handshake that lingered. Right away there were small things that felt off. Multiple external deadlocks on the same door. A note pinned to the front desk that read in polite, clipped handwriting about keeping certain windows closed in winter for guest safety. The thermostat smelled faintly of chemical cleaner, as if someone had tried to scrub away smells that weren't theirs. The other guests looked normal enough: families, solo travelers, a few students. We unloaded and went to our room, told ourselves to get rest for a full day of slopes tomorrow. At 1 in the morning, one of my roommates came down to say she'd heard something in the basement. The sound was not what the word basement usually evokes. It was the odd scrape of furniture dragged across a concrete floor, and a muffled little noise that could be a laugh or a cough or a sob. You can cheat your ears into hearing what you want. We found the door to the basement locked. There was a key, but the lock had a padlock on the outside that looked like it had been secured from the hallway.
the kind of thing that locks from the outside to keep the inside in. There was also a small hand-lettered sign, "Private, staff only." We should have called the manager. We should have gone back to our rooms. Instead, curiosity and a kind of skepticism got the better of us. My friend found a loose panel in a supply closet, and we squeezed through into a narrow, water-smelling stairway. The basement was not staff quarters. It was made up of small rooms, barely big enough for a person to stand in, repurposed into sleeping spaces. Sleeping bags lined the floor. There were supplies and a small heater that hummed like a contented animal. The smell of stale breath and cheap laundry detergent made the air thick. What made the blood in my face run cold was the corkboard. It was a messy collage of faces, Polaroids tacked there in clumps, with dates and notes and clipped items from newspapers about missing persons. Someone had taken care to pin information about people, descriptions, last known whereabouts, phone numbers scribbled in shaky hands. There were names I'd seen on missing posters, a slender silhouette last seen heading toward a bus stop, a student who vanished after leaving a party. There were photos of people when they were asleep, photos taken in doorways, photos taken through curtains. Beside the board, in a neat stack, were files. They read like someone cataloging opportunity. We tried to leave quietly and bolt the door. The bolt on the stair landing slid easier than it should have, and then there was a hand on the rail. The owner stood at the top of the stairs, smiling as if the place was a splendid surprise someone had arranged. The smile didn't reach his eyes. He asked what we were doing. We had the ridiculous, stupid courage of people who think they can talk themselves out of trouble. We mumbled about hearing noises, about being concerned for other guests.
He said, in the same soft tone he used for booking confirmations, that the basement was for staff and storage. He offered us a discount for the rest of our stay. We told him no thanks and started up the steps. He locked the door from the hallway. Panic is an odd thing. It sharpens focus into small, intense details. The texture of a handrail, the exact way light slips through a crack, the sound a bolt makes when it slides home. We pounded and shouted at first. We turned the deadbolt on the inside, and then realized the bolt the owner had used was different. It had jammed, or perhaps been reinforced from outside. Voices downstairs replied with the kind of calmness that chills more than anger. The owner demanded to know why we were in his basement. He laughed, just a little, as if this was all part of a joke we'd failed to understand. We found a window at the back of the basement, a small rectangle high on the wall. It was fogged and smeared with the residue of a chemical cleaner. We could have called out and waited to be let up. Instead, we opened the emergency exit route that was part of the old architecture and made a plan to break the glass and shimmy out. We wrapped our hands in towels, pulled a fire extinguisher from a closet, and smashed the pane. The sound was loud in the narrow room. We crawled through a window that held our fears like a cup. We tore across the yard and into a line of trees that separated the lodge from the road. I remember the gravel under my palms and the taste of metal in my mouth as if I'd bitten something. Later, police came. Other guests who had not been in the basement told their stories. A missing backpack, a shoe found in a laundry room, late-night noises no one could account for. The authorities searched the lodge's basement and reportedly found more living quarters, evidence that people had been kept there, bedding, personal effects, and a corkboard with pinned photos. They also found files that suggested someone was tracking people, where they were from, when they arrived, and notes about whether they met alone or in groups. The owner was arrested. Reports describe his demeanor as oddly serene, like a man who had been doing a job for a very long time. Some victims were released or found. Many remained unaccounted for. The police said the owner was connected to multiple missing person reports across counties, and he was in custody as the investigation continued. I wake up sometimes and my hands are clenched like I'm still pushing through glass. The thing that terrifies me more than the corkboard, more than the thought of what someone could be planning in the cold, is the calculated patience. Someone using a business, a place that promises warmth and shelter, to fold people into a map. Winter was the perfect cover. Guests who knew nothing of the signs trusted a lodge that smelled like bleach and coffee.
The deadbolts were sometimes explained away as comfort measures or older properties, but the truth was more basic. Isolation and greed make the perfect camouflage. We were lucky. We got out. Others didn't. The owner in custody smiled for the cameras at arraignment. His smile didn't tell us anything we hadn't already felt in that basement. That people can be ordinary and monstrous at once. That winter makes everyone slower and less visible. Aftermath and the thread that binds them. 3 knocks. A shanty that returns. A corkboard of faces. Those are the images that keep waking me at 2 in the morning. They're separate stories in separate places. Vermont,
a lake up north, a lodge in the mountains. But they share the same anatomy: cheap shelter, the illusion of safety, and someone or something exploiting the thinness that winter creates. Everything is quieter in the cold. Footsteps mean more. Immersing flashlight is a big problem. A storm doesn't just make travel hard, it can erase witnesses and stall rescue. There are practical takeaways, because when the rush of adrenaline leaves, what's left is a list of small precautions that might keep you out of a crawl space or a basement, or on the wrong side of a deadbolt. Trust your gut. If a place smells like someone tried to clean away a story, ask questions. Leave notes for someone you know about where you're staying. Keep your phone charged and share a live location when you go somewhere remote. But also remember the limitations of advice. None of those things would have changed the mind of a person who intended harm, and sometimes even the best precautions can be undermined by someone who plans for them. The bigger, bleaker lesson is that cold narrows options. It makes people more willing to believe reassuring words you'd question in other seasons. It hides movements, preserves tracks for a night, and in the silence, gives predators time to work. When you're isolated, the smallest anomaly turns into a cliff. A knock becomes a pattern. A thermos on a table becomes a story. A corkboard becomes a map. I don't have neat endings for these stories. The police did their work in each case. Investigations were opened. There were arrests and charges and reports and divers and searches. In the cabin case, an owner faced charges, and people found modified crawl spaces packed with supplies. In the shanty case, divers came and left with bodies and a file that closed with no answers, while local chatter kept the story alive. In the lodge case, someone was arrested, and a whole catalog of victims and missing persons began to make a grim, patient pattern. The outcome I can't give you is closure. People remain missing. The lake still sings sometimes. The porch under your feet might hide an old bedroll. If you've ever experienced something like this, comment below and subscribe for more all-night horrors. Tell me what happened. Tell me the small things that made your hair stand up.
I read every comment, and if there's one thread that runs through these stories, it's not the supernatural, it's the human willingness to exploit darkness. Winter just makes it easier. On nights like tonight, when the wind sharpens against my window and the heater clicks off for a stubborn minute, I hear it. A rhythm that sounds a little like 3 knocks. I tell myself it's the house, but sometimes, when I'm very honest, I imagine footprints circling in the snow, a shanty with a door left open for a breath, and a corkboard with someone's face pinned, as if waiting for the next pin to fall. That image is the thing I can't shake. The knowledge that warmth, light, and a cheap price tag can lull us into a trust that leaves us vulnerable. So go out, travel, take the trip you need, but don't forget to share your plans with someone, and to listen when your skin tells you something isn't right. Winter doesn't just freeze the lake. Sometimes it freezes the options you might have in warmer weather. Stay aware, stay cautious, and if you ever hear 3 knocks in the dark, don't assume the wind is being polite.